Good evening. We're going to continue this evening with three godly men that were listed in the Bible in the book of Ezekiel as examples for people as to what even men that were outstanding in their godly living and are approved in the Bible by God as being outstanding people. The point in the book of Ezekiel is that in the day of the Lord, or at the time of the day of the Lord, or just prior to, things are going to be evil, wicked, scary. And if for those three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, if they were on the earth when that time comes, then they would not be able to influence anybody to live a life pleasing to God, even though they were very dedicated and God fearing men. They would not be able to influence anybody if they were to be alive at that time when it finally comes. It hasn't come yet. It will come, and it will come regardless of what man does to it, the earth or to the planet or whatever. Man's not going to destroy the earth. God has some plans for the earth, and they're going to come. But we looked at Noah, and we looked at Daniel, and um, it's when you look at Job, it's to me it's a Job is a very interesting book, and Job is a book I don't know, probably everybody hasn't had the opportunity, you might say, that I've had in life to share their life with other people sharing their lives with me. But I happen to have had more than one person in my lifetime that felt like they had a real empathy with Job. that that they had lived their life, they had tried to please the Lord in their life, they felt done a very commendable job of serving the Lord, and yet they had the same struggles that Job did because things hadn't worked out for them. That they had family problems, maybe they had difficulty with the conduct of their children, possibly they had marriage problems. Some had economic problems, financial problems, but because they looked at themselves as a person with a reputation, or should have had a reputation close to what Job's was, and yet things didn't work out for them. God hadn't blessed them. It seems like everything had gone wrong, and they were very much feeling like they were suffering and struggling with the same things Job was. And I have had the opportunity on occasions maybe to say to the person or to say to someone else talking about such a person that, many times with people when we get the idea that they've done a pretty good job of representing Jesus Christ to the world, and they've lived a very godly life, and they can't understand why everything isn't going smooth for them. And then they tend to drift, if they're not careful, into questioning, why is God doing this to me? And I have suggested that if they would ask people that were close to them, do you have any idea why I'm contributing, or if I'm contributing, or where I'm contributing to the problems that I face in my life? If they'd ask some of their friends, they might find out why it is they have some of the problems that they have. That maybe their what they consider exemplary testimony isn't quite as exemplary in the eyes of people who observe them as it is in their eyes. But that's not really to me the issue primarily in the book of Job. Job was a man who had exemplary recommendations. He was a man that God pointed out to Satan as being an example of somebody that whose heart was right toward God. and he also happened to be a wealthy man, and he happened to have 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he happened to be a man that was respected in his community and looked up to for counsel and advice from people that knew him and had the opportunity to counsel with him. And yet when God told Satan, and we're told about it in Job, starting right out the first book, uh, and and God told Satan, have you seen Job? He's an outstanding man. He fears me. He pleases me. He does what I want him to do. Have you noticed Job? And uh, Job was a man whose life certainly impressed Satan, but Satan, because of the wickedness, I believe, of Satan's heart to start with, and as we're told of Satan, he was a liar from the beginning. And what I believe is implied about Satan when you read about him in the Bible, that he was one who evidently was jealous of God himself and wanted to be exalted above God. That was Satan's problem. But his evaluation of people like Job, who lived an exemplary life in the eyes of God, Satan's justification or explanation for why that happened, it was because that God had made Job a very wealthy man, a very prosperous man. He had a nice family. He had a nice house, or houses for himself and his family. He had cattle and livestock and sheep, and he was well respected by the community that he was in. And so Satan's justification for Satan pleasing God was not that the love of God was in his heart for God, but because God had built a fence around him and protected him and prospered him. But if you take away the things that he has, why, he'll curse you to your face. Well, unfortunately for Job, and particularly at the point, if you stop and if you could back Job up a little bit and say, okay, Job, you gotta know the whole story. If you knew the whole story, that there was this discussion between God and Satan, and Satan told God that yeah, Job obeys you and he loves you and he serves you because you've made him successful. But if you take away all the things that are evidence of his success, then he'll curse you to your face. And God knew that wasn't the case. God knew that wasn't the case. God knew what motivated Job, and it was his love for God. And so God tells Satan, okay, you could take whatever you want, but you can't take his life. So Satan caused him to lose everything that he had, you might say, that were the evidence that he was blessed by God, you might say. And therefore Satan could twist it in this conversation that Satan was having with God. Satan could twist it to be the reason that he served God. And so in Job 1, and if you move on to the 17th verse, why, all of a sudden we read in verse 17 that one person after another comes to Job and tells him that he's lost some of the many things that he'd gained and that were evidence to his success and God's love for him. And so it's one of those situations that in verse 13, actually, if you go back to chapter 1, is when it actually starts. But But we read in verse 13 of chapter 1 that there was a day and the sons and daughters of Job were eating and drinking, I understand, at their birthday. And a messenger came to Job and said that the oxen were plowing and the asses were feeding beside them, and the Sabians fell upon them and took them away, and they've slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped to tell you. And then verse 16 says, while he was yet speaking, there came in also another and said, the fire of God has fallen from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And I only am escaped to tell you. And then in verse 17, it says, while he was still speaking, there came another, and he said, the Chaldeans came in 3 bands and fell on the camels and carried them away, and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only escaped alone to tell you. And while he was still speaking, the 18th verse tells us that there came also another and said, the sons and thy daughters are eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell, and it killed a young man. And I only escaped alone to tell you. Well, that's about enough bad news in a fairly short period of time for anybody. And I think most all of us, if we have any age on us, we've lived through hard times. We've lived through times when we had goals and had plans and we anticipated accomplishing things and it didn't work out right. And we didn't accomplish what we hoped to accomplish. We've probably all had times when we were looking forward to something that was coming our way in the way of a child being born or a child growing to adulthood, or maybe you're one of your first child to get married, or the first one to have a grandchild, or first one to have a great grandchild, and then after a while you get quite a few grandchildren and great grandchildren if you live long enough, as I'm thankful to have been able to live. And in fact, we were counting the other day, and somebody, I couldn't name them all, but I have something in the neighborhood of 30 great grandchildren. And that's kind of amazing. But then if you got word that there was a flood and they all drowned, some of us were talking just a minute ago about somebody in Monterey Bay or somewhere that the news said they were attacked by a shark and maybe didn't live through it. Well, you can get news like that sometimes as you go through life. And so what is it? How does it cause you to react? Well, Job got that kind of news because Satan had God's permission to take from Job all of the blessings that God allowed him to collect in his lifetime. And Satan knows how to destroy and to kill and to steal because that's the way he functions. That's his purpose towards those that he influences. He tries to present it as though he wants us to have fun and to have good times, but that's not it at all. He comes to kill and to steal and to rob and to destroy, and so that he's very good at. And he took out the wealth and the peace of mind and all that and comfort that Job got from his family and his livestock and his camels and his sheep and his houses, and he took care of it real quick. And so in verse 20 of chapter 1, Job rose, we're told, and he tore his mantle, and he shaved his head, and he fell down on the ground, and he worshiped God. He fell down on the ground and worshiped God. Well, how come he didn't feel sorry for himself? How come he wasn't moping and groaning and carrying on? Well, why is God doing this at this point? Because I think basically at this point, he knew that he'd done what the Lord had wanted him to do. He knew the Lord had enabled him to prosper, and he knew it was taken from him. And he hadn't allowed it to get him down at this point. And so he said in verse 21 that naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. I'll go back to it. I'm reading from the old King James. And he said, naked I came out of my mother's womb, naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And I wonder how many of us in our lives, as we receive blessings from the Lord and we demonstrate or prove that godliness is profitable unto all things, having the promise not only of the life that now is, but that which is to come. How many of us react that way when we lose the things that are the nearest and dearest and most important to us in this life? How do you react? How do I react? And it's interesting in verse 22, the Holy Spirit inspired Job to write, in all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. He didn't sin. He didn't gripe and complain, and he didn't charge God foolishly. Now then, as time goes on, he kind of falls victim to a logic that most human beings seem to have. And that logic goes something like this. Regardless of whether I live a godly life or don't live a godly life, if I'm economically and health-wise and family-wise and relationship-wise successful in my life, I must be doing something right in God's eyes. And by the same token, and I think Satan prompts this in our thinking, if things aren't going well and we've lost the things that are important to us and the things that we valued and the relationships that we wanted to have and intended to keep, and then we feel like, oh, I wonder what I did to cause that. Now, that's a human reaction. And that's the same kind of reaction that comes from people that are raised religiously in a religion that says in order to be accepted by God and blessed by God, you got to do the right thing. And if you do the right thing, you will be blessed by God. But if you do the wrong thing, you're not going to be blessed by God. So if you're not being blessed by God, you must not be doing the right thing. And that may not be, there may be no equation or connection at all between what you're doing and not doing and the condition that you live in. There may be too, but the problem or the thing that all of us have to realize is just because we're successful, let's just say financially, doesn't mean that we're pleasing God. Some of the biggest cheats and tightwads and etc. are the most wealthy in the world. And some of the most generous people in the world are the least wealthy. Yeah, sometimes there's very generous people that are very wealthy. And sometimes there's very generous people that are not generous, but they're fairly kind-hearted people. So life is not on a balance to weigh like gold or something if you're weighing things of value, where if you're doing kind things why you'll get more gold. And if you're doing unkind things, the balance will tip the other way and you won't have near as much gold. That's not the way life is. And it's important that we know that. And it's important that we know that in some cases, why we have success or why we do not have success. I have right now a loved one that is fairly close to my wife that's leaving this life, and we'd like to see her have success in her with her efforts to get treatment, but the doctors have said they can't fix it and there's nothing they can do about it, and she's probably not going to make it. Okay, so does that mean that she's not doing something she should be doing? No, I don't know of anything that she's doing. Just because I don't know it doesn't change anything, but I don't know anything that she's doing or should be doing that she's not doing in this life to be blessed of the Lord. I don't know of anything. I know her fairly well. My wife knows her better. So again, we know that it's appointed that a man wants to die. So we're all going to die some way. We're all going to leave this life somehow, and we don't know why. But if we go down the road, and Job, as he goes down the road, he gets to the place where he is buying into the idea that's being presented and promoted by his friends, because Job has friends, and they come to see him, and that's very commendable of them. I have friends, and I sometimes like to go see them to comfort them or something like that, and so I do go see them, but I hope I never go and do the kind of thing that they did, Job's friends, when they came to see Job. But so Job winds up. God winds up actually. Satan is there at this first meeting that they have in heaven, and he lets Satan destroy Job's wealth and health. And Job has boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. I mean, it's a pretty terrible thing. That if I was going to think about how to make somebody miserable and not take their life, that would fit what I would think would be pretty bad. And so it as it goes through time, Job, there's another meeting and Satan is there, and God says to Satan, "Remember my servant Job? I'll let you motivate me to enable you to destroy him and make his life miserable." I'm paraphrasing completely. Make his life miserable, and you did, but he still loves me and he still serves me. And so then Satan, true to form, he says, "Well, yeah, but you take his health away from him and he'll curse you to your face." So God said, "Okay, you can't take his life, but you can make his life miserable." Well, that's a paraphrase. And so Satan does. And that's when Job winds up sitting in a pile of ashes, scraping himself and with a pot shirt, something to clean up pots, and he's miserable. And so he's doesn't know, he not only does he lost everything of value and importance to him, but he's physically miserable. He probably itches and burns and Probably oozes the sores from the boils, and he's miserable. And so his three friends come to see him in the second chapter of the book of Job. And there's Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamathite. And they made an appointment to come together to mourn with him and comfort him. And I would ask you, if you were going to go comfort somebody, what would you tell them? Would you tell them that you're hiding sin and there's sin in your life, and that's the reason why you lost all of your wealth, and now you've lost all of your health? And God doesn't do that except to people that aren't walking pleasing to him, and you've sinned against God. Is that what you tell your friend? Now, then, if you knew that, or just for example, if you knew somebody and you knew that they were married and they had a wife and they had children, and you also knew that they were living in adultery with another woman on the side, you might have some basis to say that, I don't know whether this is what has contributed to your present condition and loss of the things that are a blessing to you, but what you're doing is not pleasing God. If you knew that to be true, that's fine. But if you knew nothing about this person that would cause you to be at liberty to accuse him or her of some sin against God, if you were going to mourn with him and comfort him, I would think that you would need to encourage him maybe to examine himself, all right? But I would think you would be also very concerned that he not wrongfully accuse himself of sinning against God, or worse yet, what Job did was to feel that God did this to me, and God only does this to people that sin against him, and I haven't sinned against him. So why is God doing this to me? Was his reasonable, logical question. But he formats or frames his question from the perspective that this only happens to people who sin against the Lord. It's judgment from God, and God is the one that judges people this way when they sin against him, and I haven't sinned against him. And he was right. He was right. He wasn't bragging. He wasn't boasting. He wasn't foolishly self-righteous. He knew that he had not sinned against God. And so he's troubled. And the worst thing about it, his friends who come to help him, they don't know any better than he does, I guess. That isn't necessarily so. So we read in the second chapter of Job, the 12th verse, that when they saw Job from a significant distance, they lifted up their eyes far off from him, and they didn't recognize him. And again, picture this poor guy. I mean, he's lost everything. He's lost everybody. His wife is telling him, why don't you curse God and die? And he's telling her, you talk like one of the foolish women. Should we receive good at the hand of God and not receive evil? We got to take it in stride, so to speak. But and then when God allows Satan to take away his health, he afflicts him with bubbles from boils from his head to his toes, and he's just miserable. And he his three friends, they come and they see him. They lifted up their eyes. They knew they didn't even recognize him. They lifted up their voice and they started crying. These three grown men, and they tore every one his mantle and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. So they sat down on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word to him. Nobody said a thing. For they saw that his grief was very great, very great. And that was probably a little bit comforting. And they should have stayed that way, just crying and empathizing with him, but not trying to tell him how to solve his problem, because they didn't understand why this had happened to Job any more than Job understood why it had happened to Job. Nor would any other human being know that there was a meeting in heaven and Satan said that Job pleased God because God had built a fence around him and made him successful. And then when that didn't cause Job to turn against God, that Satan said, well, skin for skin, whatever a man has, he'll give for his skin. So he doesn't want you to curse his flesh. And so God says, okay, you can't take his life, but you can do everything but. So in the 3rd chapter we get of the book of Job, we read that after this, Job opened his mouth and cursed his day. And Job spake, and Job said, let the day perish when I was born, and the night in which it was said there was a man-child conceived. And let the day be darkness, and let not God regard it from above, neither let light shine upon it. He's just plain discouraged. And he goes on in the 5th verse, darkness and shadow, let darkness and shadow of death slain it. A cloud dwell on it, let blackness of the day terrify it. For that night let darkness seize upon it, and let it not be joined unto the days of the year. Just instead of celebrating the date of my birthday, let's just take it off the calendar. 8th verse says, let them curse it as they curse the day who are ready to rise up their morning. And let all the stars of the twilight thereof be dark. Let it look for light, but have none. And let it see the dawning of the day. Neither let it see the dawning of the day, because it shut not up the doors of my mother's womb, nor did sorrow from my eyes. Why died I not from the womb? In other words, he was wishing he'd never been born. He was literally miserable. Literally miserable. Now then, when his friends began talking, they're going to try to convince him that he's suffering what he's suffering because he's a sinner that has some secret sin, some hidden sin, some sin he knows about. And I'm not going to take the time to go through the next 35 chapters, but I would say that it's worthwhile to go through those chapters and stop and think about the arrogance and the fact that those friends of his are not helping him at all in helping him to say, wait a minute, Job, that's not a given fact that you don't have hard times unless you've sinned against God. It's not a given fact that all hard times are the result of sin against God. It's not a given fact that when you happen to be successful in your corn crop or your cattle and having calves and goat and your camels and having little camels, uh, that you sinned against God. That's not a law that God has established. That's not for sure the way things work out. And so you better back off. There may be something going on, maybe some reason that God did it, and there was, but Job didn't know about it, and there was, but his friends didn't know what it was, and it wasn't that Job was hiding sin in his life. We know that because God told us that in the beginning of the story. And so in the third chapter, Job goes on, why didn't I die from the womb? Why did not I give up the ghost when I came out of the belly? Why did the knees prevent me, or why the breast that I should suck? For now should I have lain still and been quiet. In other words, why wasn't my mother able to feed me milk when I was born, and I'd have died, and I wouldn't be suffering this way? And as he continues going down the road of believing that hard times only come from God, when we sin against God, hard times are only caused by sin against God, and good times and blessings are caused by pleasing God, and God is the one that has taken away my good times and my blessings. And so it would be right if I had sinned, but I haven't sinned. And he was right. He had not sinned. It was not the reason that he had lost all that he had lost. And Satan, being the destroyer that he is, if you and I are going through any hard times that really isn't because we're sinning, maybe somebody else sinned against us, then it's important that we realize that. And it's okay to say if you've lost everything that was important to you, maybe lost your financial success, of which you were kind of at peace with because you knew you'd have plenty of money, you wouldn't use up your money, and but you've lost most of it, and now you're not sure of what the future is going to hold, and it must be because I've sinned against God. That isn't a good conclusion. That's not true. Wasn't the reason. The reason was that God wanted to demonstrate to Satan and you and me and others who would read about it that a person could still love the Lord even though he doesn't have financial success and physical health and all of his family with him and a lot of disappointments in life. He can still be right with the Lord. And the fact that he's right with the Lord doesn't guarantee that he's going to have good health and financial success. And the fact that he doesn't have good health and financial success doesn't mean that he sinned against the Lord. That's the key. That's the key. But it says it's just a fact that things go bad, not necessarily always because we sinned against the Lord, and things go well sometimes, financially, economically, otherwise, and maybe in part because we are sinning against the Lord in some situations. And in any church that preaches the idea that the only way you're going to be accepted of God is if you do enough good or enough penance for the sins that you've committed, that's not God. That's not according to the scripture at all. The scripture is very clear. For by grace is unearned or unmerited favor. For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. it is a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. And it goes on to say, for we are his workmanship, created unto good works, which God foreordained that we should walk in them. Yeah, we're supposed to walk in good works. That's true. And God will bless us for walking in his works and will and his way. But just because life is good or bad doesn't automatically mean that we're walking in his will or not. Or not. And I've known people that I know were not walking according to the will of God and who were financially successful, very financially successful, and who were inclined to believe that they were financially successful because they were walking in the will of God. But that doesn't make it so. That doesn't make it so. And then I've known people that were discouraged. Things didn't seem to go well. And in some cases, they made mistakes in their life. Not necessarily that they sinned against God, and they were not financially successful. And sometimes they bemoaned the fact they couldn't figure out why they weren't more successful. Things didn't seem to go well. Okay, there could be reasons, but the reason isn't because automatically, if you're not pleasing the Lord, things are not going to be successful. And automatically, if you are pleasing the Lord, things are going to be successful. That's not taught in the Bible. And one of the outstanding characteristics of the book of Job is that this is a man that we have God's testimony given to from God to Satan, and Satan excusing or trying to justify the fact that Job pleases God because God has built a fence around him and made him successful financially, economically, and relationship wise. And that's not true. That's not true. And at this point in Job chapter 3, Satan is just, I mean, Job is just, he wished he had never lived. He wished he'd never been born. And he goes on bemoaning that way. He says, I should have slept, and then I had been at rest with kings and counselors of the earth, which built desolate places for themselves, or with the princes that had gold and filled their houses with silver, or as a hidden untimely birth. I had not been as infants never saw light. They were there, the wicked ceased from troubling. And they weary, the weary be at rest. If they've died, Job is it's at the end of his will to live, and it's important that we realize that Job is suffering, and to some degree he's suffering at his own thoughts more than he is at anything else. And it's so Job winds up, as you might say, bemoaning the situation in verse 25. The thing which I greatly feared has come upon me. That which I was afraid of is come unto me. I was not in safety, neither had I rest, and neither was I quiet, yet trouble came. Trouble came. And so it's a bad situation, and he's got his friends there, and they're supposed to comfort him. They're supposed to talk with him and help him work through it, is a term that we use. In other words, to help somebody, to help a friend, we have a problem, something that we're trying to accomplish that isn't going well, then we can talk about, well, this contributed to that, and that contributed to this, and I mean, if I was talking with somebody and they felt that they had bad health because they'd sinned someplace, but they didn't know what it was, then we might talk about different things that they've done and whether we had anything in the scriptures that would tell us that that's what happens when you do this kind of thing, and see if it would fit the biblical pattern. But in this case, Job's comforters, and I find it really hard to use the word comforter because they're not comforters. To me, it's the least comforting thing in the world would be to tell somebody that feels like that some way they have committed some sin that they're not aware of, or somehow God is judging them as though they sinned and they don't know what it would be that they've done. And then to insist that it's not just accidental. It's not just something that you don't know about. I mean, you know what it is you did. You know where you're covering your sin. You know. Well, so the first one that speaks of the comforters is the Eliphaz the Temanite in Job 4, 1-12. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll go over a little bit of it. I'll jump from one to the other. But I'm not going to spend the time to go through all of it. But it's not that I don't think it's worthwhile, but in this venue, I'm not going to spend that much time on it. But Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, if we essay to commune with thee, will you be grieved? Okay, well, that sounds like he's at least consider, well, if we talk to you, can we talk with you? But then he says something that's a little scary, but who can withhold himself from speaking? Sometimes, if you don't know what you're talking about, not speaking is the best thing to do. Don't do anything. Then he goes on, verse 3, behold, you have instructed many, and Job had apparently. And you have strengthened the weak hands, and Job apparently had. And your words have upholden him that was falling, and has held and has strengthened the feeble knees. So Job has been a help and a counselor and a comfort to other people. And this Eliphaz, the Temanite, he recognizes that, and that's comforting words, all right. But then in verse 5, he says, but now it's come upon you, and you faint. Well, that's not very comforting. In the first place, Job hadn't fainted. He just was down. And it touched you, and you're troubled. But is not this your fear and your confidence and your hope and the uprightness of your ways? Remember, I pray, whoever perished being innocent. Okay, you get that one? And that's what I'm going to do, is try to catch a few of the statements that were made that there's just no way you can get around. But is that who? Remember, I pray you, whoever perished being innocent. Okay, nobody ever perished who was innocent, is what he's saying. Nobody ever lost their camels and their calves and their horses and their servants and their houses, and they were innocent. Nobody ever had all of their children die, and they were innocent. That's not possible. And then he holds up a hypothetical. Where were the righteous cut off? Is there any place in the history of mankind where the righteous were killed? Yeah, there are. There are. And there are also times when the unrighteous were killed. I just before we went live here a few minutes ago, listening to a YouTube of something that apparently took place between North Korea and an island that was under the control of South Korea not too long ago. And evidently there was an effort made on the part of North Korea to take over that island. Now, I don't know whether that's true, but that's what this report stated. And the U.S. military was notified as soon as the island realized what was happening, because they had like, I think, 300 or 400 people, soldiers on the island, and there was a troop or something in the neighborhood of 1,200, 1,300 people, soldiers coming to possess the island, supposedly from North Korea, as I understand it. Well, when it was all done, and it was all done in about 30 minutes, according to the timing they gave, there were 1,000 people dead and 500 people imprisoned on one side and 300 people dead on the other side. Well, certainly the people that lived on that island and were just living there and occupying there, they were innocent people. They weren't going after anybody. Somebody decided they were going to take over their island. So you've got in that situation some innocent people, and you've got in that situation, and probably the soldiers themselves that died, the 700, I think it was, that died of North Korean soldiers, they themselves personally probably had nothing to do with it, but the one that tells them what to do is more responsible. But anyway, yeah, you could have innocent people that die. Everybody knows that. That doesn't take a very bright person to know that. Is there ever a time when righteous people are killed? Yeah, there are. So the question that Eliphaz gives doesn't prove his point at all. He goes on in verse 8, even as I've seen, they that plow iniquity and sow wickedness reap the same. Well, sometimes that's true. That's true. But sometimes that's not true. Sometimes people plow iniquity and sow wickedness, and they don't reap. Maybe for a period of time or in time, or in some cases, never. Some die of natural causes before they reap. We got all kinds of criminal activity going on in the United States and in the state of California, where apparently from politicians, police officers in some cases, politicians, judges, people that are respected and supposed to be in positions to look after the welfare of the citizens, and they're not. They're criminals. And in some cases, they're going to be tried as criminals, and people that nobody expected they were criminals. They thought they were, just law-abiding citizens and doing a great job, and other people looked to them and trusted them. And in some cases, they're older, and they've been the people that trained some of the younger officers and things coming behind them, but they were criminals. So the hypothetical that Eliphaz the Temanite gives to indicate that Job, you've been successful, and that's been evidence of your righteousness, and you've had some wonderful relationships, and that's evidence of your righteousness. But nobody loses those things without it being evidence that they've sinned. That's not true. Verse 9, he says, by the blast of God they perish. Well, sometimes that's true, but sometimes that's not true. And by the breath of his nostrils, they're consumed. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. The roaring of the lion and the voice of the fierce lion and the teeth of the young lion are broken. Yeah, sometimes, but sometimes they're not broken. The old lion perishes for lack of prayer. No, he doesn't perish from lack of prayer. Pray, usually. He perishes from too much age. And I can speak from first person. I'm 86 years old, and today I couldn't get the garage door open to work, and so I wanted to hit the garage door, shut it, and then beat the door, run out of the garage ahead of the door. Well, I can't run very good anymore. My grandson kind of laughed at me because the door went back before I could jump over the beam that would keep it going down. And so he ran in there and did the same thing I did and came out without any trouble at all. Okay, but the problem isn't that there's something wrong with the garage door opener, or that there's not something wrong with the light that's supposed to keep it from coming down or something. It's just that I don't have the nimble ability to jog to the one end of the garage to the other end to jump over that light beam without tripping it. And it's the same way with what Eliphaz the Timnite is saying. The roaring of the lion and the voice of the fierce lion and the teeth of the young lion are broken. The old lion perishes for lack of prey. No, he doesn't perish for lack of prey. He perishes because he gets to where he can't take the prey down as easy and as successfully as he had. And the stout lion's whelps are scattered abroad. Now a thing was secretly brought to me. This is kind of human nature. But read it and think about it. Have I ever gotten caught up in this kind of stuff with somebody? A thing was secretly brought to me, and my ear received a little of it. Okay, he's implying that somebody's told him something that has happened in Job's life that might be the cause. Right? Does he have any reason to do that? Any basis for that? And each of us need to realize we all could be in the place of all of the players in this story. We could be in the place of Satan. We could at times be in the place of God. We could be at the times in the place of Eliphaz the Temanite. We could be at times in the place of Job. We could be in, and so to try to read through this and go over to find the things that are in it that fit with me, things I have done. And so then he goes on in verse 13, and thoughts from visions of the night, when deep sleep falleth on men, fear came upon me, and trembling made all my bones shake. Then a spirit passed before my face, and the hair on my flesh stood up, and it stood still, but I could not discern the form thereof. An image was before mine eyes, and there was a silence, and I heard a voice saying, shall mortal man be more just than God? In other words, he's trying to make Job feel guilty before God as the reason he's lost everything that's of value to him. And I've lost my time. So I'll close, and Lord willing, we'll pick it up somewhere in here this coming Sunday. Hit the like button and pass on the fact of this Bible study that others can join. And the Lord bless you. Goodbye.